Are people correct that being allied with the left is better politically or morally, or in any way, than not being allied with the left?
This is an emergency, so we all have to make up our minds about what we're going to do.
It is an emergency for women's rights. It is an emergency for the integrity and sanctity of children's bodies.
This allied stuff is just nonsense. It sounds to me like boys in the playground.
The sort of purity politics about saying that you can't organize with anybody, whatever right position they hold or whoever they are.
And the thing that drives me insane is that men on the left do this all the time. Like, we're supposed to save our political purity for our left-wing husbands.
You're going to have to reach your hands across that sticky treacle aisle. You're going to have to say, I don't give a shit what you think about abortion. I don't care what you think about religion. I don't even care what you think about pipelines and the erosion of the rainforest.
We all talk to people with whom we disagree, and we expect our politicians to work across the aisle to get legislation passed that people want and need. What feminist critics of working with the radical right usually focus on are alliances with well-funded, anti-feminist organizations that are part of the Council for National Policy. These include the Heritage Foundation, Concerned Women for America, Alliance Defending Freedom, and Independent Women's Forum. These organizations were founded to counter the gains of the social movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and especially the women's liberation movement. Everything seemed to be going in the direction of progressivism. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The Title VII amendments prohibiting sex discrimination in the workplace came soon after that. And in 1972, the Title IX amendments were enacted to ban sex discrimination in educational institutions. By the late 1970s, right-wing operatives were trying to figure out how to win elections. Anti-communism and conservative economics were no longer doing the trick. As Richard Viguerie said at the time, they could only ever win 40, 45, maybe 47% of the vote. So they hit upon the idea of tapping into the evangelical vote. They noticed that 70% of evangelicals did not vote in the 1976 presidential election. Energized by their success in getting Ronald Reagan elected in 1980, they set about building the Council for National Policy, a network of think tanks, public policy organizations, and media. Shadow Network author Ann Nelson describes the CNP as founded by a small group of arch-conservatives who realized that the tides of history had turned against them. They dreamed of restoring a 19th century patriarchy that limited the civil rights of women, minorities, immigrants, and workers, with no income tax to vex the rich or social safety net to aid the poor. The goal was to connect the manpower and media of the Christian right with the finances of Western plutocrats and the strategy of right-wing Republican operatives to create a permanent majority. Heritage Foundation, funded by corporate interests and co-founded by Paul Weyrich, is a key organization in the CNP network. Their first mandate for leadership in 1981 offered 2,000 specific ideas for reducing the federal government, increasing military spending, and ending affirmative action programs for women and other minorities. The Reagan administration adopted 60% of them. By the 1980s, the women's movement had become the most dynamic force for social change in the country. So Heritage's first mandate for leadership warned of the increasing political leverage of feminist interests and the infiltration of a feminist network into government agencies. Heritage describes critical race theory as dangerous, subversive, and sinister, and identified banning it as one of their top 2 issues in 2021. Their other top issue in 2021 was tightening voter laws. Co-founder Paul Weyrich famously said in 1980 that he didn't want everyone to vote. Another early and key institution in the CNP network is Concerned Women for America, founded specifically to oppose the women's movement. The stated mission of CWA is to protect and promote biblical values and to impact the culture for Christ. Like Heritage, CWA opposes critical race theory, homosexuality, and abortion rights. CWA has consistently opposed the 1979 UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, and continues to meet regularly with Senate staffers to lobby against it. CWA also regularly lobbies against reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act and did so even before gender identity language was inserted into the act. In a 2012 article, Janice Shaw Krause, a senior fellow at CWA's research arm, called VAWA a boondoggle for feminists and an attack on men. In 1994, at the UN World Conference on Women, Krause gave a talk on feminism and how it's been an unmitigated disaster for women. Abortion rights, she said, is not about the pursuit of hedonist pleasure. Radical feminists accurately see abortion as the ultimate weapon to escape the control of men. Abortion gives a woman the power to escape giving birth to a child that would connect her to the father for the child's whole life. Alliance Defending Freedom is a key Council for National Policy organization. ADF seeks to dismantle the separation of church and state and has successfully litigated a number of Supreme Court cases toward that goal. In Burwell v. Hobby Lobby, ADF successfully argued that Affordable Care Act mandates requiring businesses to cover birth control in health insurance plans for their employees violated the religious freedom of the owners of the craft store chain. ADF successfully argued that disallowing the Good News Bible clubs in after-school programs in public schools violated the free speech of the organization sponsoring the clubs. Catherine Stewart, who has studied Christian nationalism for more than a decade, says that it should be understood as primarily a political movement. Their interpretation of Christianity provides the ideological framework for an authoritarian, patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist regime. In aid of corporate interests, ADF successfully litigated one of the most devastating Supreme Court cases for American democracy, Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission. The court ruled that limiting corporate spending on elections violates the free speech of corporations. ADF has expanded beyond the United States, with offices in Geneva, Mexico City, Vienna, Brussels, London, and many other cities around the world. ADF UK is already working to oppose protest buffer zones around abortion clinics in the name of free speech. Independent Women's Forum grew out of the group Women for Judge Thomas, organized by Rosalie Ricky Silberman. Her aim was to support Thomas when law professor Anita Hill accused him of sexual harassment during his Supreme Court nomination hearing. Although Independent Women's Forum is a secular organization, it is another Council for National Policy network group and frequently works with Christian nationalist groups in the CNP network. IWF promotes traditional family values, and their sister organization, Independent Women's Voice, has funded anti-abortion candidates for political office. The organization positions itself as nonpartisan, but Heather Higgins, president of Independent Women's Voice, board chair of Independent Women's Forum, and Gold Circle member of the Council for National Policy, tells potential donors that this pretense is advantageous for drawing women into the conservative orbit. Being branded as neutral, she says, but actually conservative, puts us in a unique position. Our value is that we can take a conservative message and package it in a way that will be acceptable to women who would otherwise not listen to a right-wing organization. IWF specializes in using feminist arguments to advocate right-wing positions. For example, IWF has argued that gun control is sexist, that paid family leave harms women, and that regulating e-cigarettes would discriminate against women. Independent Women's Forum has regularly defended men's rights. They have opposed the Violence Against Women Act, in part because it perpetuates the idea that society is hostile to women. Historically, IWF has opposed Title IX, arguing that it forces schools to artificially manufacture interest in sport among women and harms men by taking resources for sport away from them. Now that the issue of trans-identified males in women's sport has emerged, IWF has joined with other Council for National Policy organizations and with Save Women's Sport, Wolf, and WDI USA in a Title IX coalition to oppose this development. These are just 4 of the many organizations networked with the Council for National Policy, but they are the key groups with whom some U.S. radical feminists have partnered and coordinated. Their principal arguments for working with anti-feminist, Christian nationalist organizations is that the gender identity issue constitutes an emergency, and that we can set aside issues with which we disagree and focus on this single issue. But do we agree on the gender identity issue? What feminists mean by gender is a set of sex role stereotypes, norms, characteristics, expected behaviors, assigned on the basis of sex, and that reinforce male supremacy. For Christian nationalists, these sex role stereotypes are innate. To defy them is unnatural. Many of them blame feminists for creating the gender identity problem through feminist critique of gender and refusing gender conformity. For the radical right, the term gender ideology encompasses feminism, lesbian and gay rights, and transgenderism, and they intend to roll back the gains of all three. The difference between feminist and Christian nationalist views of gender affects outcomes of jointly produced law and policy. Consider the Women's Bill of Rights, authored by Women's Liberation Front and Women's Independent Voice, introduced in Congress last May. The bill affirms that in federal law, the terms woman, girl, and mother refer to human females. Unlike the Equal Rights Amendment, it's not written to affirm women's equal standing with men in the Constitution. It merely affirms biological difference. And rather than raising the standard of judicial scrutiny for sex-based discrimination to the same level as for race-based and religious-based discrimination, the Women's Bill of Rights specifically calls for the lower standard, intermediate scrutiny, to be applied. So while the bill, if enacted, would ensure sex-segregated locker rooms in sport, it offers little protection from sex-based discrimination. The bill's far-right sponsors speak of protecting women and their unique role in reproduction, recalling past justifications for discrimination against women. The bill reflects primarily the interests of the more powerful anti-feminist organization with whom Wolf has partnered. Focusing on the one issue with which we agree also means that we lose sight of the big picture. It's useful to the Christian nationalist agenda when we set aside other feminist issues, like abortion rights. Abortion has been under attack by the religious right ever since it was legalized in 1973 through the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision. Despite their efforts, polls conducted over the past 5 decades show that a majority of Americans remain stubbornly in favor of abortion rights. Leonard Leo, longtime leader of the Federalist Society, another CNP organization, recognized that they could never defeat abortion rights through elections. He realized they needed to stack the courts with right-wing judges, a goal that was accomplished with the Trump administration. In June of this year, the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health overturned federal abortion rights, throwing the country into chaos. 13 states had trigger laws that would go into effect immediately once the Supreme Court overturned Roe. Some allow abortion only up to 6 weeks of gestation. Others ban it entirely. Even life of the mother exceptions are confusing. Already Catholic hospitals, due to their ethical and religious directives, routinely refuse procedures like D&Cs for women miscarrying a pregnancy, if fetal heart activity can still be detected. Women forced to wait for appropriate care frequently develop extreme blood loss, sepsis, and sometimes die. After the Supreme Court overturned Roe, non-Catholic hospitals in states with fetal heartbeat and life and health restrictions also began delaying treatment, concerned they might be breaking the law. Some states with draconian abortion bans began crafting legislation to prevent women in their states from traveling to another state for an abortion. This crisis for U.S. women found Wolf and WDI USA, with their single-issue focus on gender identity, offering little in the way of action or support for abortion rights. Working as the feminist auxiliary to these Christian nationalist groups retards the development of an independent feminist movement, and with that, an independent feminist voice. Every moment spent on Zoom calls is time not spent developing our own movement, our own agenda, our own lobbying networks and relationships. Our message gets subsumed into theirs, leaving the impression of fronting for the radical right. The gains of second-wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s were not due to the largesse of the Democratic Party, and certainly not to the Republicans. They were achieved through creating a powerful, independent women's movement that compelled politicians to act. We need to rebuild an independent movement with power that comes from the grassroots for true women's liberation.